Welcome everyone to today's program with Nickolay Mladenov, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. Here's Dan Mariaschin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's conversation. I'm Dan Mariaschin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International. Thank you to all of those who are joining us today. As part of our special UN at 75 series, today's discussion will focus on Israel at the United Nations from the perspective of someone with a unique position at the world body. With me to explore this and more is Nickolay Mladenov, Special Coordinator at the UN for the Middle East Peace Process. We especially want to thank the B'nai B'rith Office of UN Affairs for its pioneering role in leading Jewish communal engagement with the UN and for making this discussion possible. Mr. Mladenov was appointed by then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process in February of 2015. Prior to his UN role, Mr. Mladenov served as Special Representative for Iraq and head of the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq. He also served as Foreign Minister of Bulgaria and as Minister of Defense of Bulgaria. Previously, he was a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Bulgarian Parliament. In our discussion today, Mr. Mladenov and I will be discussing everything from the recent normalization of ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and put into context his critical role as the UN marks its 75th anniversary. Special Coordinator Mladenov, welcome to the program.
Hi Dan, it's good to be here.
Well, let's start with something that affects all of us first. What effect has the COVID-19 pandemic had on your role and on Israeli-Palestinian and broader Israeli-Arab relations? And what can you tell us about any cooperation or lack of it in the area in which you work these past 5 or 6 months?
Dan, I hope in a few years when we put the coronavirus behind us, we'll look back at this period and study in detail how this tiny little bug has affected everything well beyond the Middle East, but particularly here in the Middle East. We have seen since March, pretty much since the lockdown started in Israel and the region, since March we've seen periods of amazing and unprecedented cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, how they dealt with the initial wave of the virus on the ground, coordinating lockdown, medical assistance, all of that. We've seen how the virus has decimated the economies of countries and has had a very devastating effect on Middle East economies, on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. I think I was looking at some recent numbers about Israel and official unemployment is looking at about 20%, staggering numbers. Affecting small and medium enterprises and everyone. On the Palestinian side, it is also quite desperate. We've seen how the virus has, in a way, led to upheavals. The political crisis in Lebanon, the economic crisis and political crisis in Lebanon have been, in a way, sped up by the virus. And we've seen how really, and I think this is the latest, most interesting effect of it is that it is transcended through a number of conflicts and difficult questions in the region, getting countries to work together in amazing ways. You spoke about the Emirati-Israeli normalization at the beginning. Part of that normalization is also the ability of Israeli and Emirati companies to work together to find a vaccine against the virus. So we've seen how it has, in a way, brought humanity together. We've seen how it's caused a lot of problems on the ground. Ultimately, again, the effect of it in the longer run still needs to be assessed. But I think from a very practical perspective right now, we're dealing with the latest outbreak in Gaza. Gaza came quite late to the virus. For a very long period of time, it was contained. It is starting to explode in the last couple of weeks with numbers dramatically going up. And we're seeing the economic effects of the COVID-19 on the ground. So juggling with all of this, of course, we need a lot of support from the international community, from the member states of the UN. And one of the most unfortunate effects from my professional perspective right now is that donors globally, be they in America, in Europe, or in the Middle East, have far less money to spend on humanitarian aid for other places. And in a way, our entire system is now suffering from lack of enough funding to deal with the crisis with the coronavirus. So the effects are across the board, and I can tell you that it is probably the one thing that takes up almost 50% of our time right now.
Well, beyond the race for the vaccine, which of course is so important, what are your thoughts on the normalization between Israel and the UAE? What impact is it having, let's say, on your work? And do you see other Arab states following? There's a lot of talk about that. We see it every day. Somebody's making a suggestion about that. What do you see?
I think it's a historic achievement. I mean, there's no way to understate this achievement. It is historic because it is opening up amazing new avenues for economic, for security cooperation between Israel and the UAE. It is sending a message across the region that through dialogue and through discussion and diplomacy, you can work together and resolve differences. And I hope it also creates an opportunity for the Israelis and the Palestinians to find a way to re-engage in dealing with the challenges that they both face here on the ground. You know that in the beginning of this year, many of us were concerned with the prospect of annexation in the West Bank, and I believe that it would have had a devastating effect on the situation on the ground and the prospects for peace. It would have made, in the broader sense, a deal like the normalization deal between Israel and the UAE impossible. Now that deal is in place, it has stopped also the risk of annexation. And I hope it brings the Israelis and the Palestinians and everybody in the region around the same table, because the challenges that we're all facing, despite the specifics in each conflict in the Middle East, are in a way similar. We're facing the radicalization and religious radicalization among communities. We're facing communities that are imploding because of poverty. We're facing the threat and the risk of outside interference, weapons proliferation, etc. All of this is extremely dangerous. And if you look at the entire Middle East, one of the biggest concerns that the United Nations has is how do we focus on preventive diplomacy in a manner that we reduce the risk of escalation, reduce the risk of miscalculation, because there's so many conflicts and so many potential conflict points that just one miscalculation can lead to a chain reaction of explosions around the region. How do we put that in a conceptual framework, and how do we do it effectively? We are trying very actively in Yemen. Our teams are working actively in Lebanon to try and not just deal with the aftermath of the latest explosion, but with the aftermath of the whole crisis that country is facing. And here, closer to home, we're dealing with a challenge in Gaza, which for the last 2 years has been to prevent another war. So focusing on preventive diplomacy, I think will benefit from the Israeli-Emirati agreement. Now, whether other countries follow in the Emirati footsteps is difficult to say at this point. I hope that we will reach a point at which there will be full normalization between Israel and the rest of the Arab world in the region. And as part of that normalization, we will also see a sustainable resolution to the Palestinian conflict, because without that, we will constantly be facing, particularly here on the ground, daily challenges, which will be security, economy, the threat of escalation, which we can't handle without a broader framework. I think we now have an excellent opportunity with what has happened between Israel and the UAE, and hopefully we will see more opportunities emerge in the future. So I'm a little bit more optimistic now than I was a few months ago, but whether that optimism is justified really depends on the leaders on the ground.
Why do you think the Palestinians haven't been criticized for their opposition to this tremendous diplomatic breakthrough? What we've heard is that in the Gulf states, there isn't any kind of divorce from the Palestinians, but basically what's being said is, look, we can't wait. I mean, if you want to engage in a negotiation, we would encourage that, but we're not going to wait for that. There are too many other factors. There's an Iran factor. There are economic factors. There are other issues that, in terms of national interest, are beginning more and more and more to override what has been for decades and decades this kind of solid Arab support for behind the Palestinians. Why is it that they're not getting that message that the train has already left the station?
Dan, try looking back in the last 30, 40 years. Go back 10 years, go back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and you will see that this region as a whole has changed dramatically. And the challenges that people face have changed dramatically. The population has changed. The age structure of the population has changed. What people fear today is not what people feared 20 or 30 years ago. The very environment in which young Arabs, whether in the Gulf or in the rest of the Middle East, grow up today is very different from 20 or 30 years ago. There've been a lot of changes, and a lot of attention has been taken away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the more traditional sense of how international diplomats and politicians talk about it. So attention has been taken away. People are focusing more on their domestic challenges, but the conflict remains. And if there's one thing which I think comes out very clearly in the Israeli-Emirati agreement, and as you pointed out, the fundamentals have not changed. There does need to be a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians that actually leads to a two-state solution in which both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have states of their own with the appropriate security, economic, and other arrangements. That hasn't changed. Support for that in the Arab world hasn't changed. What has changed is the daily challenges that people face and the priorities with which they have had to deal with. Now, if you look at it from a very, internal Palestinian perspective, and just bear with me for a couple of minutes, if you happen to have grown up in a village somewhere in the West Bank, which in 1994, after Oslo, was designated Area B, effectively that means that it is under Palestinian civilian control and Israeli security control. Fast forward to today, that village has probably grown to be a pretty big town. And the divisions that were designed back then, Area A, B, C, which was all supposed to be transitional just for a few years, have been erased by the reality of today. But if you live in that village, which is now a small town somewhere in the West Bank, and someone comes and steals your car, and which police station do you turn to? Do you turn to a Palestinian police station? Do you turn to an Israeli police station? How do you handle the fact that the nearest security people that you will see are probably, IDF soldiers outside of a settlement close by? Who do you turn to for assistance? How do you look for work opportunities, etc.? So the very reality in which people have grown has become much bigger than these agreements that were signed and these maps that were drawn back then. Now, what I'm trying to say with all of this is that as the reality has changed, so have people. But the problems have not changed. The problem that you do need a sustainable solution remains the same. And what is really required for that is leadership that is willing to engage, leadership that is actually willing to sit down at the table and negotiate. Going back just a couple of years, I think it was 2016, when together with our American, Russian, and European partners in the quartet, we came out with a report looking at what are the recommendations to Israel and to the Palestinian leadership and to the international community. What can be done to improve the situation on the ground, to reduce the risk of violence, to improve the economic environment, with the hope that that will create the conditions for a return to meaningful negotiations. Now, those recommendations that we came up with back then are still very, very much valid. What is lacking is the leadership that is willing to sit down and do it. I or anyone else in the UN or no one in the outside world, not even the United States or the European Union or the Arabs or whoever, can do it without the leadership that is willing to do it on the ground. And again, I go back to your previous question. I hope that now that this normalization deal has come about, people will read the writing on the wall. You do need to sit down. You do need to sit down and discuss things. And our role from the outside, as mediators, as facilitators, is not to substitute the leadership on the ground, but it is to actually support both sides of this negotiation to make it meaningful. Now, again, will this happen? We have to see in the future. On the Palestinian side, there are many challenges that people face. Hamas has control of Gaza for over 12 years now. Elections haven't happened since 2006. There's a very difficult economic crisis now. On the Israeli side, you have, perhaps too many elections, if you wish. Too often coalitions changed, very difficult coalition environments. So there are objective reasons on both sides why this has been so difficult. And I hope that as we look forward, things will become a little bit easier because of the understanding that, you can't do a negotiation without two sides to it.
Oh, that's true. But you have, Jason Greenblatt worked so long and so hard, at least under this administration, together with his colleagues. And the message of 3 years, more or less, of the Palestinians simply refusing to enter into a serious negotiation, at least under that rubric, under the rubric of the Trump plan. And there have been, of course, many other plans before. We can go back to the Kerry Initiative and go all the way back, of course, to the Oslo era. It does send a message that there is a lack of leadership, a lack of determination to get this done. It hasn't been for lack of opportunity. But I want to move to another important issue, which is a cloud over the entire region. Iran is in Syria. It's, of course, in Lebanon. It's in Yemen. It has a relationship with Hamas. How does the Iran factor work into the discussions that you have with players in the region?
Well, I think it is, it depends on what perspective you look at it from, because if you look at it from a broader regional perspective, when you engage with leadership in the Gulf, it is obviously one of the driving factors in all of the discussions that exist there. If you look at Iraq in particular, or Syria for that matter, or Lebanon, as you said, Iranian presence there is one of the most important factors in driving any political or security process. When you look at it from a sort of a perspective here in Jerusalem, we see practically on a daily basis, including I believe today and 2 or 3 days ago, when there has been kinetic activity in Syria, as the diplomats call it, by Israel against targets that they deem connected to Iran. When you look at it from a very specific perspective of, for example, the situation in Gaza, Hamas, and our negotiations on trying to keep the situation there quiet, it is not such a visible factor because the engagement there is very practical and on a daily basis. But I think across the region, there are various there are various aspects of how you have to deal with outside interference. And going back to my earlier point about preventive diplomacy needs to happen both on the ground in specific conflict areas, but also in the broader aspect of the region. The Secretary General has, on a number of occasions, said that perhaps overall the Middle East, with everyone involved, needs to look at some sort of an architecture that allows everyone to ultimately sit down at the table and limit the risk of interference and put some rules of the game, if you wish, that allow countries to work together for common benefit rather than strive against each other. But again, this is a very difficult construct given where the situation overall in the Middle East is. I personally, from a more daily perspective, here in Jerusalem, dealing with the situation, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza, we're more occupied with the what can be done to stop balloons, for example, from flying out of Gaza and burning fields in Israel, or improving the humanitarian situation there, or inside Gaza, or how to really create a construction that helps Israel and the Palestinian leadership to sit at the table. I suppose that if we get on that front to a meaningful negotiation, we will see a number of factors outside that will try to disrupt that negotiation, and we'll have to do a lot to protect ourselves and to protect the negotiation itself from negative impact and negative interferences.
Let's talk about Hamas for a moment. Their stated goal is to destroy or dismantle Israel one way or another. And our view is that is frequently underplayed in public discussions and conversations at the UN and beyond the UN and other diplomatic forums. Why do you think that's the case? Because from our point of view, the conflict is often portrayed as just a spat that requires the occasional intervention of a referee, and not a situation in which you have a terrorist organization with genocidal intentions embarking on a violent campaign against civilians. How do you sift through all of that?
Well, I would tend to disagree with you. I don't think it's understated. I think if you go back a year or so ago when Nikki Haley was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, a draft resolution condemning Hamas almost went through the General Assembly for the first time in ever, I think. And I think over time, people understand the risks that or militant organizations controlling territories like Gaza pose to security well beyond their borders. We've been very critical of actions that Hamas has taken on the ground, be those inside Gaza or outside, but particularly in relation to rocket firing from Gaza on Israeli communities outside, balloon launching, etc. But we also have to work with the reality that we have on the ground, and that reality means that we need to deliver, not just humanitarian aid and development to the people of Gaza that they may survive, but give them a prospect for the future. And that prospect involves trying to get all the Palestinian factions to reunite around a platform that is based on peace, that is based on denouncing violence, on accepting the recognition of the State of Israel. And we've worked very hard, and we continue to work very hard also with Egypt and other countries to try to get to that point. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, the reality on the ground that I have to deal with requires that we, as the UN here, engage with the consent of Israel and with the consent of Egypt and with the consent of the Palestinian leadership, with everybody. And that allows us to actually engage in preventive diplomacy and prevent escalations on a daily basis. On the broader picture, you're right. Everyone who wants to be part of a peace process, of a process that is legitimate and recognized by the international community, will need to accept the principles that are basic to such a process. Denounce the wish to destroy the State of Israel, recognize the existence of the State of Israel, recognize negotiations as a peaceful manner of resolving conflicts, stop using violence, rockets, etc.
One more question on Hamas, and it's really on our minds every day. The remains of the Israeli soldiers, Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul, also two Israelis who were being held, Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed. What can you tell us about the status of that situation?
I'm afraid I will refrain from revealing anything of any interest in a public discussion. I will only say that I know that the Israeli government and leadership are very much engaged on this issue, that they are talking to the relevant regional factors who can help hopefully resolve this humanitarian issue. We have a number of UN reports, UN statements and calls, not only for the release of information as to the status of the civilians and soldiers, but calling on resolving this issue as soon as possible. I've met with the families a number of times. We're in touch with the Israeli government practically on a daily basis on this issue, among others. And it does need to be resolved as soon as possible. I think the pain that the families have lived through is just terrible, to not be able to know the fate of your loved ones. And generally, Dan, dealing with the Middle East for a number of years now, there is so much pain across the board in practically every family that I meet, be that if an Israeli family, be that a Palestinian family, be that an Iraqi family, it doesn't matter at this point. Everyone has suffered tremendously. And that is why all of these issues, the issue of the missing people in Gaza, the issue of families who can't bury their loved ones, all of this is very close to our heart, and we're trying to support the governments in resolving it as quickly as possible. But it is difficult, and I will say that it is not something that should be approached lightheartedly. It is a very complicated task. Hopefully, we'll see some progress.
I'd like to bring Lebanon back into the discussion for just a moment. Though Lebanon is not necessarily on your plate as special coordinator, but I was wondering if you could share your take on UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. The Security Council recently adopted a resolution calling on Lebanon to give UNIFIL more access. It also reduced, I think, the number of peacekeeping troops in reforming the size, rather, of the peacekeeping force. But given the history of Hezbollah's actions and UNIFIL's response, can Israel realistically trust UN forces in the region? I mean, the inflow, the constant inflow of weapons, the storage of weapons, where they're deployed in southern Lebanon, in homes, in clinics and hospitals and schools, and all of the things that we read about all the time and over so many years. Does the recent action by the Security Council change that course?
I think it does, and I think it's a very, very important amendments have been made to the resolution on the UNIFIL mandate. Really increasing the ability of both the mission and the requirement that it be provided with access and support to sites that it wants to visit, but it was unable to visit or inspect because of existing limitations. Now, I think if you look at it more broadly, UNIFIL has certainly faced a number of challenges in its existence, but it has overseen perhaps the longest period, a very long period of time between Lebanon and Israel in which escalation has been limited and more or less controlled. So with the mandate that has been given by the Security Council, UNIFIL is doing the best that it can. I know that the general who heads the mission right now is extremely good. He's very professional. He's trusted both by the IDF and the Lebanese forces as an important intermediary to communicate across the blue line. I know very well that what the mission can do is really limited by the agreements reached within the Security Council by those who are there. So any agreement to, for example, increase its role, increase its visibility, or decrease its role and visibility goes back to the Security Council. The guys on the ground are very professional. They know what they're doing, but they work within the limitations of the mandate as it exists. And I think the changes in the text this time around are a very good compromise and will allow them to have a much more visible role.
Well, some years ago, you served as foreign minister of Bulgaria when Hezbollah perpetrated a terrorist attack in Burgas on Bulgarian soil. Bulgaria then led an effort within the EU. You brought this issue, you brought the issue of Hezbollah to the EU, and we wound up with a bifurcated result that the military wing of Hezbollah would be recognized as terrorists, but then there was concern that there was a political wing, and because they were so involved in the government of Lebanon, now we see one country after another, Germany most notably, in Europe, declaring that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. I mean, look, all money is fungible. To Hezbollah, they don't see it as two organizations, they see it as one. How has your experience when you were foreign minister at that moment informed your view about your current position as you look at Hezbollah and the EU?
Dan, though, that was a terrible incident, which 7 Israelis and 1 Bulgarian were killed. And Burgas, and I remember those days very well, and I remember that you and I spoke very often in that period. As a result of the investigation that was then concluded, the Bulgarian government took the issue to the EU, and the consensus that was reached then was, as you said, to sort of name Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist organization by the European Union. Now, this was some years ago, and a lot of things have happened and changed since then. I'm not privy to any specific new internal discussions in the European Union on this, but what I know is from back home is that the case of the Burgas terror attack is now being finalized in court. And I expect very soon that there will be a verdict. And there was recently a statement by Bulgaria's chief prosecutor who said very clearly where some of the connections in this case lead to. And once that verdict is out, I believe that the Bulgarian government will need to decide how it handles the actions that what action it will want to take once the court proceedings and the verdict have been finalized. But I expect that to be happening in the coming days or weeks.
Yeah, we'll be certainly watching that closely. To go back to what we call the peace process, Palestinians for decades, really from right out of the box, have called for a right of return, whereby millions of descendants who've fled or left during the War of Independence, 1948, would just simply be allowed to migrate to Israel, thereby, as a result, ending a democratic Jewish minority state. And it's a complete non-starter for Israeli leaders across the political spectrum, as you know, and it's a poison pill for the peace process. And it continues to recur in every discussion that we see in international fora. Yet, despite this, there are UN agencies that push this narrative, notably UNRWA, and also the Division for Palestinian Rights, Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People at the UN. If the UN is concerned about the peace process, and it's a member of the quartet, and a two-state solution, how can this counterproductive narrative, which has led millions of Palestinians to believe that this is going to happen, and it's not, how can that be allowed to continue without some kind of applying the brakes to what's happening on this particular issue?
Dan, and it sounded, I think I counted 3, 4, maybe 5 questions in there under the guise of one. I'll try and segregate.
That's only because of our time limitations.
And try and answer them. Look, there are a number of issues that have been defined both by Israel and the Palestinian leadership in Oslo as the final status issues that need to be resolved through negotiations. And that includes the status of settlements in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, borders based on 1967 lines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of these issues is the prospect of returnees to the Palestinian territories. And I think over the past decades, there have been a number of proposals, if you go back to the Clinton parameters and others, that have put sort of viable and agreeable solutions to this problem. Now, the broader problem there is that we're nowhere close to such a negotiation right now between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because there is effectively no peace process. The other part of your question is on the UN agencies. I'm always very reluctant to speak on behalf of the United Nations, because that's us trying to speak on behalf of the universe. There are member states in the United Nations that have their politics and their bodies in the United Nations and mandates that are created by voting in of the member states, be that in the Security Council or the General Assembly. And then there's the Secretariat, and that's the Secretary General, myself, and a number of other people. We are the ones who mediate the differences and try to resolve conflicts as they emerge based on the mandates that we receive from the member states. UNRWA, you pointed to, UNRWA was, and I keep hearing this from my colleagues here all the time, when UNRWA was created, everybody thought it would be there for a few years and it would be only temporary. It's been now, over 50 years that it has existed. It has grown into one of the biggest agencies handling everything from healthcare to education for generations of Palestinians across the region. Now, UNRWA, would disappear if there were a political resolution to the Palestinian question, and that the people that UNRWA handles and serves would be served by other agencies and other governments, depending on where they live or whatever the agreement at that point is. Until that point, if UNRWA stops functioning, we stop the provision of education or of healthcare to hundreds of thousands of people, be they in Gaza, be they in the West Bank, be they in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or different, other parts of the Middle East. So, again, we go back to the very beginning of this conversation that, there are a lot of realities that exist, a lot of narratives that continue to exist, as you say, that are tied down into the fact that there has not been a meaningful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in my mind, that meaningful resolution only begins if perhaps we, as well as the UN and as the international community, begin by admitting openly, if we have to put it in writing, that both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have a historic, religious link to this land and an equal right to be masters of their own fate. In a way, if you look at this, hasn't been stated clearly and publicly since Resolution 181 in 1947 that spoke of a Jewish and an Arab state. And to me, this is a very important starting point, because we can discuss borders, we can discuss arrangements on the economy, on the security. We can talk about where the capital will be, East Jerusalem. We can discuss settlements, anything you want. But the basic premise from which we need to start is that everybody needs to admit that both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have an equal right to have a home in this land, because they both belong in this land. The rest of it is a matter of negotiation. Back in Oslo, a list of final status issues was agreed between both sides. These issues still remain very valid. And if we go through that list and look at the various proposals that have been made over the years, including the latest proposal that has been made by the Trump administration, which is very different from all the previous proposals that have been made. But if you put everything on the table, I'm sure we can find a way that is out, that is sustainable, and that it is in line with the broad principles of UN Security Council resolutions and international agreement. But the driving force for that, the driving force really needs to come from inside and from Israeli and Palestinian leadership. Our role, again, as the UN, as the Quartet, as the US administration, the Europeans, others, is to support and facilitate. But we can't do it without the local leaders.
Well, one final question. You mentioned education, and it's extremely important, and it may be perhaps the most important issue going forward. We talked about UNRWA. If you were educating for peace, and we have constantly raised these issues over so many years in terms of Palestinian textbooks, not only Palestinian textbooks, I mean throughout the Arab world for so many decades. If you demonize not just Israel and Zionism, but the Jewish people, because it's all connected. If you demonize, you're never going to get to the point where that you'd like to reach, which you've just laid out. And under the leadership of Secretary General Guterres, the UN has committed itself to fighting anti-Semitism, including the denial or trivialization of the Holocaust. But we see that the demonization of the world's only Jewish state at the UN is very much in play when it comes to the Palestinian side. How do you address that?
Let me split that in two. I think your point about education is extremely important, and I think everyone needs to be far more vigilant than what we are doing now as to education. And I say this coming from the Balkans, and I'm sure, Dan, you know what I mean by that, where we've had our own terrible history of what we teach about our neighbors, about the lands of our neighbors, about the existence or non-existence of whole countries, languages, nations, etc. Overcoming that is extremely difficult and extremely important. That's why both as the UN and as NGOs and others, we need to be very, very vigilant about what is being taught in textbooks. But how do you overcome this? That's a very that's a critical question. I think you overcome it by really focusing on and explaining to everyone today what is the real modern interpretation, the modern version of what anti-Semitism is. Because it's very easy to say, oh, we're against anti-Semitism. But when you start breaking it down, to me, that means effectively three things. One is the denial of the right of the state of Israel to exist. Two, the denial that the Jewish people, that their home is in the state of Israel. And thirdly, this is the denying the very fact that Israel is here to stay. It's not a temporary, creation. It is a permanent state. So, denying the right of Israel to exist, denying its right or ability to continue functioning, and that it is the home of the Jewish people is critical. And as far as that is explained to everyone and understood by everyone, I think that is a very good starting point for doing away with these myths that are out there. Now, how you go around doing it is you work with the member states and with the governments in the United Nations. That is the most effective route. And I think over time we've seen how there have been ups and downs in these in this narrative, and certainly more effort needs to be put at that end. But what I can assure you is that as far as the Secretary General is concerned, and myself and our colleagues are concerned, we are very, very focused on this issue. We're very focused on standing up to any anti-Semitic comment or statement that is being made, standing up very clearly against racism and xenophobia, but also making sure that in our work we treat everyone fairly, and we recognize fairly that all peoples in this land have legitimate rights that need to be recognized. And in my mind, then the only way to move forward on that is going back to the initial question, is if we're able to get the two sides to negotiate, and to negotiate on the basis of a two-state solution. That is the only framework that preserves the peace and creates a sustainable prospect for the future.
Well, Special Coordinator Mladenov, thank you. Thank you for all you have invested these 5 years in the work that you do. We very much appreciate your taking the time to speak with us. And as we say to each other every day, so many times, stay safe and stay well.
Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Dan.
I want to thank Special Coordinator Nickolay Mladenov for being with us today and sharing his insights as the United Nations marks its 75th anniversary. A recording of this conversation will be available on demand on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel shortly. I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope you will come back for future discussions. Until then, take care, continue to be well. We'll see you again soon.